Hello YouTube. The Elder Scrolls universe has a vast, and I mean vast, amount of lore. Not only have I done a video about the lore of the different types of strange trees, I also did one on grass types. Now today, at the request of one very persistent viewer, HillaryDana3057, who requested this video more than 50 times under different videos over several years, I decided to finally make a video on all the different types of mushrooms, lichen and fungi of Tamriel. And I'm not doing it alone, as in the meantime a new Elder Scrolls lore channel appeared that does a lot of videos on Tamriel's flora and fauna, Hannah the Hermit. So with a subject like this I decided to ask help of an expert. And after the video, be sure to check out her channel, which is in the description of the video, where you'll find way more videos delving into Tamriel's flora and fauna. So let's roll the intro and let's talk about some mushrooms. Alright, now Tamriel has an incredibly large flora and fauna, and many things are surprisingly fleshed out to a large degree. As such, we have substantial lore for many, and I mean many, of the different types of mushrooms, fungi and lichen found around the continent. So therefore we need to make a little bit of a choice, namely how to talk about them. We decided to first talk about some of the mushrooms you can find everywhere around Tamriel, and then later talk about some of the mushrooms specific to one province, so for example the gigantic mushrooms that you find in Morrowind. That way this video will have the best possible structure. Also, you'll notice that some of these organisms are fleshed out to a great degree and others not so much. So while we could talk for several minutes about some, others are not that well fleshed out. Plus, some have straight up been imported from real life, in which case I might spin in some real life information. And like I mentioned earlier, we are talking about 3 different categories of organisms. While to a non-expert eye they may all seem to be just mushrooms, the different organisms in this video fall into 3 different categories: mushroom types, lichen types and fungi. The main difference is that mushrooms are a well-known type of fungus, so basically all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. So I'm mentioning mushrooms because that's what people know best, but we'll also be talking about other types of fungi. Now, lichen are a bit weird, and I personally never heard about them before this video. But to give you an idea, lichen are a sort of combination of a fungus and an algae or bacteria that live together in a sort of partnership, where the fungus gives structure and the algae or bacteria provide food. They are usually found on trees, rocks and soil, and they don't really look like typical mushrooms, but still fall within the fungus category. It seemed useful to tell you that before we start and the biologists suddenly start commenting about it. I mean, this was still very oversimplified, but that's all the information that you'll need for this video. Oh, and sometimes the games simply reuse 3D models of one mushroom for another, so don't yell at me, hey, you're using the same mushroom model again. That's not me, that's the developers. So, that said, let's start with some of the mushrooms, lichen and other fungi found almost everywhere on Tamriel. Although when I say everywhere on Tamriel, that doesn't mean these mushrooms are just everywhere randomly in every spot around the world. Some of them have very specific habitats and areas that they're found in. A good example is this first mushroom, the blue antoloma, a bright blue mushroom with a cap in the shape of a pointed dome. It's bright blue with darker shades down the domed cap and lighter blue shades near the top of the cap. These mushrooms can be found basically everywhere across Tamriel, in caves and forests and in other spots of nature. There isn't all that much lore about them, as all we know is that they most like to grow in the shade and in the forests, not in open field, and sometimes in caves, and that they smell pretty bad according to one quest. It's a potent ingredient for alchemy, where it ravages magicka, causes cowardice and can be used in health potions and in invisibility potions. Although, funnily enough, this mushroom is just straight up lifted out of the real world. I said we would get some of these examples, so why not start with one? As the blue antoloma is a mushroom in our real world, where it's known as the Antoloma hochzeteri. Ignore my terrible Latin. Now this mushroom primarily appears in New Zealand and India, where it looks almost exactly like the mushrooms that we find in the game. In real life, so presumably also in our Tamrielic version, the blue antoloma actually plays a pretty important role in the forest ecosystem. as it breaks down leaf litter on the forest floor and as such is essential in the forest floor ecosystem where they appear. Considering they mostly appear in temperate forests on Tamriel as well, it quite likely fulfills this same role on Tamriel. Although, most importantly in my opinion, it just looks really cool. I mean, look at it, it's blue, it's cool. And the fact that we have it in the real world makes me happy. Now, next up, let's talk about a blue-grayish fungus with a bumpy texture, which the Elder Scrolls Online calls the cave bracket mushroom. This type of fungus tends to grow on the walls of deep caves and moist caves around Tamriel, and they grow to quite large sizes, as regular cave bracket mushrooms can easily grow as tall as a human. They seem to be relatively rare though, although I can't really find a specific criterion for their habitat, as the caves that they are found in aren't particularly special. So I can't really figure out why some cave environments have these mushrooms and why others don't. If I had to take a guess, it probably has to do with a lot of nutrients needing to be available for such large mushrooms, but you know, that's just speculation. But it would mean that the soil and the makeup of the walls that they grow on most likely has an influence on what makes a cave a suitable habitat for them and what doesn't, but you know, that's just speculation. Now, next up I'd like to switch over to my guest Hannah, who will tell you everything about the next mushroom, the fly amanita, a mushroom that we find in both Skyrim and in Cyrodiil. Take it away, Hannah.
Fly amanita is a bright red capped mushroom with a thick white stem, instantly recognizable by its iconic appearance and deep roots in both real-world mycology and Elder Scrolls lore. In Skyrim, fly amanita is typically found growing in temperate forests, especially near tree stumps or fallen logs. These mushrooms are also commonly seen in caves and groves, where they benefit from moist, shaded conditions. The fact that they thrive at the base of trees may be a nod to their role as decomposers, feeding off dead wood and symbolically linking them to the cycle of death and rebirth. In Oblivion, this mushroom's appearance is more recognizable. Its vivid cap is dotted with the iconic white raised warts that mirror its real-life counterpart. Fly amanita appears across the Great Forest and other wooded regions of Cyrodiil. This mushroom is extremely common in cities, nodding to the fact that its restorative properties in both agility and health are desired amongst citizens and alchemists alike. Real-world associations also inform its in-game symbolism. The appearance of fly amanita closely mirrors Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric, a psychoactive and mildly poisonous mushroom. While the Elder Scrolls series never explicitly equates fly amanita with hallucinogenic properties, there is no shortage of ingredients that are consumed for both pain and pleasure. Its reoccurring appearance across provinces implies a shared knowledge of its properties amongst herbalists, alchemists, and healers from Cyrodiil to Skyrim. Even though the climates of these provinces differ, fly amanita seems to adapt, thriving wherever the forest is old, the soil is damp, and the trees provide ample shelter from the harsh light of day.
Thank you, Hannah. Now let's talk about another mushroom that we find almost everywhere around Tamriel, the so-called luminous rusula. It's actually just a pretty basic brown mushroom with a rounded cap and whitish speckles. They tend to give off a slight glow in the dark, and you can usually find them growing in small clusters. While their alchemical effects vary per game, they generally have poisonous effects. They grow primarily on the soil of shaded places like forests and in caves, and at least in Morrowind, where just eating them has the effect of water breathing, they are used to survive for longer periods of time in the water. In addition to that, wild kwama in Morrowind are known to sometimes use these mushrooms as a food source, which is pretty cool. Now, next up we've got the dusk mushroom, a mushroom that grows almost all across Tamriel in both caves and in ancient closed ruins, so ruins without too much sunlight, as this mushroom thrives in low light conditions. It's also a mushroom that's actually known for being quite tasty, as it's used in quite a few cooking recipes across Tamriel, like for example dusk mushroom soup. And it's said that these mushrooms taste a little bit like meat, while also having its own quite distinct flavor, and a distinct smell which those who like the mushrooms will immediately recognize. Unfortunately, that's about all the information that we have on this kind of mushroom, as it doesn't really seem to have any other lore or an other obvious kind of comparison to real life, where we can draw conclusions out of. So therefore I'll now move on to the next specimen in this video, the Gloom morel, a small black-brown mushroom which apparently has a terrible smell. Now, these mushrooms are actually quite interesting compared to some of the others on this list, as it's completely unique to the Elder Scrolls universe and actually has some very interesting lore. You see, this little mushroom is actually quite a dark specimen, as it's said that it can get a lot of its nutrition out of decaying flesh and primarily grows in places that have been tainted by Daedric magic in some way, which is really interesting. Now, it's important to note that this does not seem to be a mushroom that came from Oblivion and just grows in places where Oblivion's influence is strong. Rather, it seems to be a Tamrielic mushroom that is evolved to live off decaying flesh and the specific makeup of soil that has been tainted by Daedric magic, which is really cool, although they are quite rare. Alright, now having spoken about the Gloom morel, let's now give the mic to Hannah again, who will talk about the whitecap mushroom.
Whitecap is a pale, shelf-like mushroom commonly found in Skyrim's caves, forest floors, and Dwemer ruins. In the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, the Whitecap Circle is an unmarked and atmospheric location found just north of the Twilight Sepulchre and near the Shrine of Akatosh. It contains a perfect ring of whitecap mushrooms, closely resembling the naturally occurring toadstool ring formations found throughout the game. While the location is not formally marked on the map, it ties loosely to the quest Kyne's Sacred Trials, which directs players to hunt the guardian bear in the nearby woods. The circle's proximity to this quest objective, along with the presence of an archery book and a weapon, hints that it may be a shrine or tribute to Kyne, the Nordic goddess of storms and the hunt. The appearance of the White Ring Circle strongly mirrors real-world fairy rings, naturally occurring circular mushroom formations resulting from the outward growth of fungal mycelium. In folklore, these rings are often associated with supernatural activity, especially in European traditions where they are believed to mark portals to the realm of the Fae or sites of ritual dancing for spirits. These rings were seen as both magical and dangerous, sometimes said to curse those who entered them without leaving an offering. Skyrim's Whitecap Circle is symbolic of this real-world phenomenon. Though no explicit magical effect is triggered by entering the ring, the placement of blood, bone, and book implies a story left deliberately untold.
Alright, now next up is the Impstool mushroom, a small orange-brownish mushroom with a rounded cap. This mushroom can be encountered across almost all of Tamriel in dark caves, with them often growing in groups of 3 or more. While some lore sources say that they often grow in groups of 10 or more, in the games they will often appear in groups of just 3, although in Skyrim they do often appear in larger groups. This mushroom, like many in this video, is an alchemical ingredient, and while the exact alchemical properties the mushroom has changed throughout the different games, it often has alchemical properties useful for poisons. Now, especially in Skyrim, its primary effects being damage to health, lingering damage to health, and paralysis, meaning that this one seems to be poisonous by nature. Now, in terms of real-world comparisons, it looks a little bit like the real-world orange-cap boletus mushroom. However, that's generally where the comparisons end, as the Impstool likes to grow in caves, while the orange-cap boletus tends to grow in the forest outside. So I can't do much speculation about that one. Now, one mushroom that we can do some real-world comparison to again is the Emetic Rusula, which is very similar to the real-world Emetic Rusula of the same name. With their white stems and red caps, they are very similar to the real-world version. In the Elder Scrolls universe, they are found all over the continent, primarily in forests and in other shaded places, where they can get some light, but not too much light. Another thing that they need for their habitat is to have a very damp ground. That's why they primarily appear in places like southern Cyrodiil near Leowyn, but they do grow all around the continent as well in smaller numbers. They have some interesting lore about them though, as they are quite different from some of the other mushrooms on this list. You see, for example, with the previous mushroom, the Impstool, I told you about how they can be found in clusters of several different mushrooms. But this one is different. You see, while there are definitely some examples of what looks like Emetic Rusula clusters, it turns out that these clusters are actually one big mushroom with multiple caps, unlike some of the other mushrooms that grow in clusters, which tend to consist of multiple mushrooms. This one tends to be one big organism. Now, while this mushroom has the same name and look as the real-world Emetic Rusula, it does seem to be slightly different though. While the habitat is similar, being dampy, mossy forests, where it has mutually beneficial relationships with trees and helps nourish the forest, which I can see the Elder Scrolls version doing as well, as we find them in similar places. There's one piece of real world lore which we at least don't have confirmed for the Elder Scrolls version of this mushroom, and that's that in the real world the Emetic Rusilla is known as the vomit mushroom or sickening mushroom, as if when you eat it uncooked it will cause vomiting and diarrhea within about 30 minutes, which is something that we don't have lore on for the Elder Scrolls Universe version. As while in some of the games it has appeared in, the Emetic Rusilla has had poisonous effects, in others it had quite beneficial effects, so I'm not sure if the vomiting thing translates quite as well to Tamriel. Okay, so the next mushroom that I'd like to talk about is a small brown mushroom growing in dark humid forests and the floors of humid caves all around Tamriel, the Namira's Rot mushroom. This mushroom should probably be one of the most interesting mushrooms, as it's literally called after a Daedric prince, but there's literally no lore on it other than that it's a small brown mushroom with a texture on its cap kinda looking like a skin disease or skin rash. We don't know why it's named after Namira, although if I had to speculate, since Namira is the Daedric prince of decay and death, it's possible that the mushroom perhaps assists or lives off natural decay processes, but that's just complete speculation and not something that I can back up with the lore, as there's no more lore on it. Now, next up I want to talk about a fungus that appears almost everywhere on Tamriel as well, in the forests and next to damp rocks, the Stinkhorn fungus. This orange and brownish fungus has a tall standing shape and a white base. It seems to have two different variants, one variant which is native to Tamriel's heartlands and has a strange claw-like shape on top, while the generic Stinkhorn found almost all across Tamriel actually has a rounded off tip. What exactly the reason is for this difference is unclear, although it may also be possible that the Stinkhorn evolved over the course of the almost 800 years between the two appearances, in which case I wonder what led to this evolution from the 2nd to 3rd era where it suddenly, got a claw-like shape. Why is this claw-like shape a more successful species to such a degree that it supplanted the original one completely? We just don't know, although maybe it's just, developer oversight or a new design. Now, the next mushroom that we will talk about are the so-called ambershine mushrooms. These mushrooms appear in several places around Tamriel. They don't really have lore, except for that they are golden yellow glowing mushrooms that grow primarily in eastern Morrowind, but can be found in several other places around Tamriel as well, such as hidden glades and caves in Skyrim, at least in the 2nd era. They tend to grow in groups and clusters, but don't really seem to mind what kind of soil they grow in. I'll be honest, there isn't any other lore on them other than that they look kinda pretty. Now, it's almost exactly the same story for the bruising webcap. Now, this little mushroom looks like a miniature version of some of the really big mushrooms in Morrowind, and it simply has very little lore as well. But these small variants appear all over Tamriel, and just like some other mushrooms, it's actually based on the real-life bruising webcap, or considering that this mushroom has the same name and looks as the real-life version, we can assume that just like the real-life version, the bruising webcap gets purplish bruises when it's damaged, and it's likely just like the real life version, a mushroom that contributes to a forest ecosystem by having a mutually beneficial relationship with some tree roots, aiding the trees through nutrient exchanges, which is actually really cool. And considering that we find these mushrooms in forests, just like the real life version, we can pretty much be certain that it fulfills a similar role. Just like with the bruises, I presume it's the same function and same process as in real life, because otherwise it wouldn't be called the bruising webcap, but hey. It's still speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. Now, another mushroom that appears in different provinces is the so-called poison pax mushroom. A large type of mushroom that looks straight out of Morrowind, except this mushroom appears not just in Morrowind, but can grow in different places on Tamriel, with either ash, swamp or jungle soil. As they appear in Tamriel's jungles like Valenwood, they appear in the ashlands of Morrowind, and they appear in the marshes of Blackmarsh. These mushrooms, as the name suggests, are highly poisonous, and they can appear in several different variants, from really small ones standing on their own stem, to shelf variants clinging to walls, to really big ones, almost the size of Morrowind's largest mushrooms, which we will get to talk about later in the video. Now, finally for the Tamriel white mushrooms, I want to talk about this mushroom, the violet coprinus, a small mushroom growing in small clusters around the continent. While it's called the violet coprinus, its cap is actually primarily blue, although the edges of the cap actually do have a slight purplish coloration. Just like many other mushrooms, they have alchemical effects, and while they are different in every game, most effects tend to be poisonous. Their habitat is generally above ground in the shade of forests or under the caps of larger mushrooms in Morrowind. And it doesn't really have an obvious comparable mushroom from real life. Although there are real life coprinus mushrooms, they don't look like the violet coprinus at all, so we can't really compare them. Alright, now those were the mushrooms that grow all across Tamriel, although there are a few unnamed ones that I haven't mentioned, which you can see on screen right now, but they don't have any lore at all, or even a name. Now, next up we will be talking about some of the province-specific ones. Now, just a really quick disclaimer, just because I list a mushroom here under a certain province, doesn't mean that it only occurs in that province, or will always only be in that province. You see, the developers could just say, oh wow, that's a nice looking mushroom, and just place it in a different province. And, you know, despite months of research, I might possibly also have missed some places where they are in different provinces. So, when I say that a mushroom is native to a certain province, keep in mind that I might have missed something, or that they may be placed somewhere else in the future. So just take it as that the vast majority of these mushrooms and fungi grow in that province, okay? Okay, then let's start with the first province, the Summerset Isles, which seems to have 3 mushrooms exclusive to the Isles. First of all, there's the blood crown mushroom. The blood crown mushroom are red mushrooms growing predominantly in some caves on the island of Auridon. These mushrooms have spores that are part of one of the quests in the Auridon zone, as together with some other mushrooms they can create a potion that can help prevent a person falling for magical illusions. This same quest actually introduces us to the other 2 types of mushrooms used for the same potion, and therefore they have almost the same amount of lore, meaning nearly no lore, but there is some. Because the only thing we know about blood crown mushrooms is that they are red and that they have spores which have tiny amounts of red liquid in them, almost like blood. The other 2 mushrooms introduced to us are the lavender cap mushroom and the gleam cap mushroom. Now, on the lavender cap mushroom I can be short, as it's a small mushroom, surprisingly not lavender colored as you can see, as it's more yellow and reddish, although its lore states that it smells slightly like lavender, so that's probably why they gave it the name. Now, the final Summerset exclusive mushroom, the gleam cap, is once more a very similar story, only grows in caves and has been named after one of its properties, as the spores that emerge from under its cap seems to glitter and glow in the lore. Very cool, but very little specific lore. Now, next up we have the province of Hammerfell, and it has 2 unique types of mushroom and 1 lichen as far as I can tell, all of which we don't know that much about, although they are really interesting. The first is the puss pocket mushroom species, a type of mushroom growing in Hammerfell subterranean caves. These weird and nasty looking mushrooms are very light on lore, but we do know that their presence and their spores in caves make the food of cave explorers spoil and rot far quicker. Interestingly enough, they may or may not have a connection to the Daedric Prince of Pestilence and Disease, Periite, as they have some connection to one of his worshippers, although it's a bit unclear. But considering that these mushrooms, which can grow from really small to really big, look like they are kind of sick and make food spoil and rot, a connection to Periite would be logical. Also, despite playing on the highest settings in the Elder Scrolls Online, the small mushrooms of this puss pocket mushroom type seem to be moving flat images instead of 3D models, which is pretty hilarious, but I suppose that having like 1,000 small 3D models would be kind of a waste of, computer power. Now, the next kind of mushroom, while not retconned, we haven't seen in the Elder Scrolls games since the early 2000s, since the Elder Scrolls Travel Shadowkey, the grey mushroom, which, again, doesn't really have lore, other than that it grows in caves and can become really big and kind of acts like an energizer, as it will increase your speed when you eat them. So, it may possibly be some kind of drug. Also, it's suggested that goblins may eat them, but other than that, we don't have any lore on them, sorry. Now, the final Hammerfell mention is this glowing cave lichen. It looks cool, seems to thrive in caves below desert oases, and we really don't know anything else about it. It glows, it's blue, it's a lichen, and it primarily seems to make its home in oasis caves in Hammerfell's deserts. Cool. Now, I will quickly mention High Rock, the province, because, Well, as far as I could tell, it doesn't have any mushrooms unique to it. I mean, of course, High Rock has mushrooms, but none that don't appear anywhere else as far as I could tell. So there are a lot of mushrooms, but we all covered them in the Tamriel generic section. So let's now move on to one of the provinces with the most mushroom lore, Skyrim, and I'll give the mic to Hannah again, who will talk about the first of many Skyrim exclusive mushrooms, the Bleeding Crown, which is different from the Blood Crown that we talked about before.
Bleeding crown mushrooms are immediately recognizable by their appearance. A red-capped toadstool smeared with what looks like dried blood. They favor the darkness of caves and dank subterranean passages between Skyrim's rich soil. The name Bleeding Crown comes from both the blood-like coloration and the crown-shaped ripples of the cap. Among the many alchemical specimens scattered throughout Skyrim's harsh environments, Bleeding Crown is the only fungus to earn direct mention in the Herbalist's Guide to Skyrim. Agnetophalia, the author of the guide, includes Bleeding Crown as a part of her argument that Skyrim is unjustly dismissed by outsiders as a land of little refinement or botanical value. She writes, "The caps of these mushrooms do indeed appear smeared with blood, though it is often hard to see in the dark, damp places in which they grow. Not uncommonly found in Skyrim, their abundance is countered by the difficulty in acquiring them. As any experienced herbalist knows, the darkest of caves often conceal far more than mere mushrooms. Nonetheless, these potent fungi, when combined with certain powdered antlers, produce a mixture rendering one quite susceptible to poison. Their usefulness is also quite apparent when mixed with lavender, creating a substance highly resistant to magic." The unmarked alchemist camp, located just north above Evergreen Grove and Falkreath Hold, is a notable spot for Bleeding Crown. The area contains several patches of Bleeding Crown growing among the trees behind the tent. The camp includes useful alchemy resources, such as an apothecary's satchel, the alchemy skill book, De Rerum Durinis, and the Alchemist's Journal. The Alchemist's Journal found at the site notes the presence of a mushroom grove and outlines a plan to study the enhanced growth of Bleeding Crown in the area, as well as the ecological impact of both the mushrooms and nearby Nirnroot on the downstream environment. The location above Evergreen Grove offers ideal conditions for such research. Moist and shaded soil, a steady water source, and the presence of Nirnroot. These combined factors likely contribute to the unusual fungal proliferation observed at the location.
Alright, next up we will talk about another lichen, the so-called giant lichen that grows in Skyrim's Hjalmarch swamps. It grows in swamps, and it's a lichen. Oh, it's also used in alchemy, where it ravages health primarily and makes one weak to poison and shock. And it restores magicka if combined with the right ingredients. Oh, I almost forgot. You see, while it's called giant lichen, once you harvest these fungal specimens from their plant, you see that they are not that big. But then when you put the harvested fungal matter on the ground, you see that they are pretty big. Now, I could say that this is probably a development error where they did not scale the models of either the harvestable plants or the ingredients correctly, but you see, I want to be fun about it, so you could say that this lichen gets giant once it's harvested for some reason. So once you pluck it from the entire fungus, it gets bigger. See? Interesting lore. Yeah, I got nothing else on the giant lichen, sorry, there really just doesn't seem to be any more lore, and even that was stretching it. The same goes for this swamp fungus, often found near giant lichen in Skyrim swamps. It seriously has just no lore at all, other than it being a swamp fungus, so sorry to disappoint. Hannah, take away the disappointment by talking about blisterworts, please.
Blisterwort is a thick-stemmed, reddish-brown mushroom with a bulbous cap and blistered texture, giving it a diseased or inflamed appearance, hence its name. It often grows in clustered formations, low to the ground, and thrives in dark, damp places where little else can survive. In Skyrim, it is most commonly found deep within caves, mines, and Dwemer ruins, often clinging to the sides of rocks or tucked into shaded crevices. Alchemy merchants, including Arcadia, regularly sell multiple at any time, and after completing the quest, salt for Arcadia. At least 2 samples can be regularly taken from Arcadia's Cauldron in Whiterun for free without being classified as stealing. In the built-in Radiant Alchemy tutorial quest, players will be instructed on how to use an alchemy lab. Upon requesting permission to use the lab, the alchemy merchants will all consent with the same reply, "Long as you clean up." You know how to use it, right? Mix a couple of ingredients together, see what happens. A little wheat and blisterwort makes a healing potion, if you didn't know.
Thank you for that, Hannah. Now, next up we have another pretty cool mushroom, the so-called canis cup mushroom, a type of orange-brown fungus which has a really strong smell. They were found in the Second Era in the east of Skyrim, and when you eat them they were able to mask your smell for predators due to the overwhelming smell of these mushrooms themselves, meaning that the predators will think that you are a mushroom rather than prey. Really cool. And it makes me wish that we actually had a game mechanic like that in Skyrim in the 4th era, as it could make playing a survival playthrough on Legendary far more fun, as you could then eat this mushroom to keep wolves and the like off your smell. But unfortunately that's not the case in the final game, and unfortunately that's about all the lore that we have on canis cup mushrooms. So, let's turn the mic to Hannah again, who will talk about the next fungus, Mora tapenella.
Mora tapenella is a shelf-like bracket fungus found growing on fallen logs and tree stumps throughout the woodlands of Skyrim. It favors damp, shaded environments, with notable locations in the coniferous forest of Falkreath and the Reach, though it can be found in nearly every hold. It is not so common in the Rift, where scaly foliota is the primary fungus found amongst trees. Mora tapenella has soft brown caps with creamy white gills and stems. In the text, Flora and Fauna of the Druidoc Mountains, Telraves de Canis, an Imperial botanist, offers a heartfelt explanation of life within one of Skyrim's most feared and misunderstood regions, the Druidoc Mountains. Often avoided due to their association with the Reachfolk clans, the mountains hold a vibrant ecosystem that few outsiders have dared to document. He writes, "This whimsical fungus grows at the base of fallen trees or decaying stumps. I find them beautiful, despite their rather unremarkable appearance. They grow in places death has touched, undeterred by the silence that it brings. I admire their tenacity. They may not be the most attractive specimens in the Druidoc mountain range, but they are certainly among my favorites." This appreciation naturally leads to questions about the name itself. Although some assume a connection to the Daedric prince Hermaeus Mora due to the shared term, linguistic analysis suggests a different origin. Rather, Mora is derived from the ancient Eliadun word for wood or forest, indicating that the fungus's name simply means forest tapenella. Eliadun, the language of the Aelids, descends from the ancestral Almeris tongue and shares many lexical elements with other Meric languages. After the Alessian slave rebellion, the dispersal of the Aelids led to regional dialects forming, the most notable of which influenced what would become Old Cyrodiilic, while other variants emerged in areas like Valenwood due to cultural blending with the Bosmer. Therefore, the word Mora in Eliadun can refer to Daedra in an adjectival form of Dark One, and shows up in titles like Hekel Mora, meaning Outcast Daedra, and Canomora, meaning Daedric Herald. In this sense, Mora becomes a poetic way of referring to Daedric spirits, since the Aelids used the term Daedra to mean not our ancestors, to describe the beings of oblivion. Thus, while Mora tapenella most directly translates to forest tapenella, the word Mora itself is deeply rooted in the linguistic and spiritual traditions of the Aelids.
Alright, next up we have the scaly foliota, another alchemical ingredient with relatively little lore on it, and alchemical properties which really don't give us any clue as to the mushroom's function. because all we really know is that these mushrooms like to grow in clusters, specifically on the birch trees in the Rift region of Skyrim, like Hannah mentioned. Now, while there isn't much lore on this mushroom specifically, it's actually very similar to the real-world shaggy scaly cap that appears in similar climates and locations on trees and tree stumps in our world. And in our world it's known for having a very unpleasant smell, but we don't have any lore about that on Tamriel specifically, although it would be lore friendly if someone ever mods smell into Skyrim. And now it's time to give the mic back to Hannah again, and we'll talk about glowing mushrooms.
Glowing mushrooms in Skyrim exist in two distinct but related forms. The harvestable alchemical ingredient found clinging to cave walls, and the towering luminous stalks that define the landscape of Blackreach. Both varieties share their characteristic blue glow and fungal biology, but their scale, function, and lore implications differ significantly. The harvestable kind appears in two distinct forms: a cluster of 7 mushrooms, which leaves the 2 central stalks behind when harvested, and individual mushrooms that disappear entirely upon harvesting, leaving only a small root. Since many formations include both clusters and singles, even a small patch may yield multiple harvests. Their bioluminescence may serve practical ecological functions, such as spore dispersal, or be a byproduct of prolonged exposure to the unique energies within Blackreach, particularly Etherium. It is plausible that the ingredient-sized mushrooms represent an unaltered or earlier form of the larger fungal structures that dominate the cavern's architecture. A primary alchemical effect of glowing mushroom is resist shock. Fitting, given its affinity for subterranean zones where lightning-spitting Dwemer constructs might be encountered. While not heavily referenced in narrative texts, glowing mushrooms contribute significantly to Skyrim's lore through their environmental storytelling. The Dwemer ruins are often overrun with these fungi, suggesting that even in the long-abandoned cities of the dwarves, life in fungal form finds a way, feeding off the rich oils and strange glow of Dwemer mechanisms. The sight of a massive glowing mushroom forest in Blackreach leaves a strong impression on those who find it. Sindirian, a famed alchemist from Cyrodiil, wrote in his field journal of the potential symbiotic relationship between Crimson Nirnroot and the enormous fungi that inhabit Blackreach. He theorized that the fungus acts as a natural reservoir, drawing moisture from the damp subterranean air much like a sponge, thereby creating the perfect conditions for Nirnroot to thrive. Though glowing mushrooms themselves aren't the centerpiece of any quest, collecting them becomes an adventure on its own.
Now, the Elder Scrolls Online's Blackreach actually added quite a bit more lore about the gigantic towering glowing mushrooms of Blackreach, officially naming them Gloom spore mushrooms. And these mushrooms are weird and super interesting, because these fungi, as Hannah said, seemingly came to be by absorbing the strange energies of Blackmarsh's soil, which made it so that they became bioluminescent, so started glowing. They can glow either blue or purple, and they behave really strangely in some cases, as it seems that strong exposure to the spores of the gloom spore mushroom can make it so that the mushrooms will start growing within living creatures until the mushrooms have all but covered them. Whether or not these mushrooms then possess these creatures, we don't know, but in fact we know very little about these creatures to begin with, as they're just, crown store pets in the Elder Scrolls Online, but it's very strange and interesting nonetheless. And not just that, some parts of these mushrooms are sturdy enough to be crafted into weapons, which again is pretty cool. Now, Blackreach actually has more types of fungus, like this strange orange fungus and these small white mushrooms, but other than that they all glow, we know literally nothing about them. Other than that, we can reasonably presume that the fact that they attained bioluminescence can be explained by the same mechanism as the gloom spores, so likely they got their glow through strange energies of Blackreach that came through the Etherium. Alright, it's time for the next province, Cyrodiil. Now, the first 2 Cyrodiilic mushrooms that I would like to talk about are the Greenstain Cup and the Greenstain Shelf. Now, these 2 mushrooms seem to be somewhat related to each other, perhaps they have common parentage, but they are explicitly not the same type of mushroom, as when we use them in alchemy, they have radically different properties. This is actually pretty useful as a denominator to find out whether mushrooms are the same type or not. despite different or similar shapes, and these ones have significantly different alchemical properties, as the green-stained cup, for example, restores fatigue, while the green-stained shelf restores and fortifies luck, two properties that the cup does not have. And as such, they're probably two different fungi, although they may still be distantly related somehow. Now, of the two, the green-stained shelf is by far the rarest, with very few mushrooms of this type found in Cyrodiil. In fact, in the game there are only a handful growing around the province, while the green-stained cup is very abundant in contrast. Now, while the green-stained shelf seems to be able to grow anywhere, but rarely grows anywhere, so it's rare, the green-stained cup mostly grows in swampland and damp ground, particularly growing in ground above ground. The green-stained cup can grow in both clusters and by itself in the ground, having its own step, while the green-stained shelf primarily grows alone and on rocks and fallen trees, needing something to latch onto as it doesn't have its own stem. Now, these two together are very similar to the so-called green-stained fungus of our real world, although in real life it's mostly one unified fungus, while in the Elder Scrolls universe you've got a cup and a shelf variant. In our world, these fungi were often used as a base for paint due to their strong pigment, and I'm willing to speculate that they fulfill the same role in the Elder Scrolls universe, just like I'm willing to speculate that just like in real life, their primary function in the ecosystem is breaking down dead wood and helping with the decomposition of the forest. Okay, next up is the bog beacon fungus. This mushroom has a tall stem with a broad yellow tip and is exclusively found in Cyrodiil's Blackwood marshes. The tip of the fungus can be harvested as an alchemical ingredient that can be used for magicka restoration, shielding and several damaging properties, and they thrive in damp soil, but they can survive in drier soil as well. There isn't really that much that we know about this type of fungus. If I had to guess, it's probably very similar to the real-world swamp beacon fungus, which is actually far smaller than its Tamrielic variant, but does look the same, although the Tamrielic version seems to be a bit taller than the real-life variant. That having been said, I suspect that once more it has a similar function in the ecosystem to its real-life counterpart, breaking down decaying plant matter in damp soil and in the wetlands, recycling nutrients for the ecosystem. Now, the next mushroom is the so-called capstone cap mushroom, a curious mushroom as it grows in really cold caves, which is actually not a mushroom habitat that we've encountered before in this video. Unfortunately, we know very little about the mushroom, except for the fact that they are able to somehow stop bleeding, although even that is a bit of an unknown, as we don't know how they do so. I mean, how do they stop bleeding? You see, it's possible that they are first required to be grounded up and applied to a bandage or applied to the wound, or perhaps they just stop outward bleeding somehow by eating them. How that works exactly, we don't know. We just know that they do and that their habitats are cold caves in Cyrodiil's north. Alright? Alright. Now, let's talk about the next mushroom, which is the cairn-bolete mushroom, a small white mushroom growing in clusters in the caves of Cyrodiil. Interestingly enough, there is once more a mushroom in real life named bolete, but unfortunately it's nothing like its Tamrielic counterpart, the cairn-bolete, because not only does it have different colorations, it grows outside, while the cairn-bolete only grows in caves in Cyrodiil. Now, these mushrooms, just like some others on this list, actually grow especially well in spots where organisms have died and have been buried, likely feeding off the nutrients in the carcass. Interestingly enough, this has made it so that some people in Cyrodiil believe that these mushrooms mark the spot where someone died, but that's most likely not always the case, as presumably they simply feed off the nutrients of dead carcasses, and as such it's also possible that a wolf or a bat or any other cave creature simply died on that spot. Alright. Next up is the steel blue Anteloma. On this mushroom I can be pretty short, as the steel blue Anteloma seems to simply be a mushroom that's essentially a regionally evolved variant of the blue Anteloma that we talked about before, as very first mushroom of the video, except that it has slightly lighter coloration and as far as we are aware only grows in Cyrodiil's forests. Cool. Alright, next up the wisp stalk. Now, the wisp stalk is a fungus that we have not talked about before. They are thin, tall, milky white mushrooms that grow in clusters in Cyrodiil's many caves. Their habitat is really primarily underground, surviving with little to no light. There's no real obvious real-world example to compare them to, as the closest thing that I could find, a real-world fungus, really live above ground and they don't seem to have caps, so yeah, no further story here, sorry. The only thing I'd like to be able to speculate on is that the wisp stalk likely earned its name because of its milky white color, but you likely already came to a similar conclusion yourself based on the visuals. Yeah. Anyway, Cyrodiil's mushrooms may be plenty, but they unfortunately often have very little story. In fact, I will group the next 3 fungi together as they're of a similar fungus family, the polypore family, and they all have very little lore once again. First off, we have the tinder polypore mushroom. And despite tinder being in the name, this mushroom does not help you find disappointing sexual partners. What it does do, it grows on trees in small clusters, and one of the primary alchemical properties of the mushroom is to resist disease, and another is invisibility. So maybe they are actually helpful with disappointing tinder dates, protecting you against STDs with the resist disease and allowing you to ghost your date with invisibility if he or she is a creep. Okay, so without jokes, I am reaching here as we literally know nothing of them, other than that they primarily grow in the mountainous environments and even near the snow line of the mountains, meaning that they are at least resistant to some cold. That being said, in the real world, tinder polypores are actually used as part of fire starting material, which is cool, and considering that it has the same name on Tamriel, so has tinder in the name, I presume that they fulfill a similar function on Tamriel. Now, interestingly enough, in the real life version, they are actually able to break down and kill the wood of living trees that they live on, making this, if it does the same on Tamriel, the first real parasitic fungus of the video. Although I do presume that there are others, except most likely they just didn't have it in their stated lore, or in their real life version. Now, next up is the cinnabar polypore, and it has a very similar story. It's the second polypore of Cyrodiil and also grows on trees. It appears primarily in the southwest of Cyrodiil, and unlike the tinder polypore, which appears primarily in the mountains, this one grows in the more temperate forests of southwestern Cyrodiil. Now, the real-life version of this polypore is actually not parasitic, but primarily grows on dead wood, helping to decompose it rather than killing living tree wood. Now, the Tamrielic variant actually appears with 2 different colored caps, a red and a yellow cap. There actually are alchemical differences between the 2 differently colored caps, suggesting that they may be 2 different types of mushroom, although they both grow in the same habitat and sometimes even next to or close to each other. Other than that, there's really nothing we know about them, so all that remains is talk about the final polypore, the Dryad Saddle polypore. This mushroom is super interesting, but not because of its stated lore, because all we really know about them is that they are super rare, appearing all over Cyrodiil but in very small numbers, just like the green-stained shelf. That's all that we know. But what's interesting is that this mushroom is actually the only mention of a Dryad in the Elder Scrolls lore, meaning that the people of Tamriel are aware of what a Dryad is, even though so far it seems that they don't exist anywhere on Tamriel, so they may simply be a creature of legend, just like in our own world. That said, it can also be that they just copy-pasted the real-life Dryad saddle into the games instead of renaming it to something more Tamriel appropriate, like the Torchbuck saddle or something, or the Spriggan saddle, as the Dryad saddle actually exists in real life. But in real life it's actually quite different, as it grows on living wood and is a parasite like the tinder polypore. However, considering the Tamrielic variant grows on stone and on cave walls, there isn't much that I can say about them speculation-wise. So it's time to move on to the final couple of Cyrodiilic mushrooms. First, there's the clouded funnel mushroom, which is found primarily in northern Cyrodiil, the mountains and in the Blackwood. They are small mushrooms with a brown-white cap and have several restorative but also damaging alchemical properties. Once more, this mushroom has very little lore and is almost straight up lifted from the real world, where real-world clouded funnels also help with breaking down forest litter in an ecosystem, just like several other mushrooms on this list. I wish there was more lore on it than that, but there just isn't. Just like with the final Cyrodiilic mushroom, the Elf Cup, it is also straight up lifted out of real life. It has a cup-like dome and primarily grows on rocks in southwestern Cyrodiil. It has the capability of curing diseases and is thus a pretty valuable ingredient. Now, other than the shape, the Elf Cup's resemblance to the real-life Elf Cup is pretty sparse, as the real-life variant has some different properties, like growing on dead wood, buried in the ground in the woods instead of on rocks like in the Elder Scrolls universe. Alright, next province, Valenwood. And Valenwood is a bit of a disappointment, as it just literally has 2 exclusive mushrooms or fungi as far as I could tell. Very disappointing considering that the province is supposed to be an outlandish jungle. Although it does have a lot of mushrooms, just none of it are really exclusive to it. Except for the first one, the blanched Rusula cap mushroom, an orange-brownish mushroom found in coastal caves, which some sources say is actually a white mushroom, which in the game it is not when you look at it. We have no idea what it does or what function there is, although there is a real-world blanched Rusula mushroom which grows in hardwood forests, so not in caves near Valenwood's beaches, so we can't really use the real world version for clues either. Now, the second Valenwood exclusive one is the speckled Stinkhorn cap, which we also just have no lore on at all, other than that it's apparently a very rare mushroom and smells putrid, and that it's probably a regional variant of the regular Stinkhorn. It's said to have alchemical properties, but if it does, then we have no idea what it is, since we've never had it as an ingredient. The same can actually be said for elsewhere, where it only has one exclusive mushroom or fungi, and we honestly again don't know a lot about it, as the only exclusive mushroom that elsewhere seems to have is the prune morel mushroom, which is a light brown yellowish mushroom which is actually known to be edible, although they are bitter and have a very pretty strong loamy scent apparently. Having them in a dish seems to be a bit of an acquired taste in elsewhere, mainly eaten by non-Khajiit, as the Khajiit themselves hate the bitterness of this mushroom and prefer something very much sweeter. Now, Black Marsh does a little better, as it has a grand total of 2 unique mushrooms. Still a bit disappointing, considering that it's Tamriel's biggest swamp and should probably have thousands. Still, it's quite likely that both Valenwood and Blackmarsh actually have thousands of unique mushrooms, but that due to game mechanics, we just haven't seen them. You see, provinces with by far the most mushrooms are of course Morrowind, Skyrim and Cyrodiil, and to no one's surprise, that is where the most modern mainline games take place. And all these games have their own alchemy system, so if you need a rich set of ingredients, you need to program that into your game. Meanwhile, the other provinces that have appeared mostly in the Elder Scrolls Online do have some unique mushrooms, as we see in this video, but that game has the fun quirk of it taking place all across Tamriel, and at least for a significant portion of its history, players could not just explore all of it, as there were level limits and you could only travel within your own home alliance. This means that the alchemical ingredients of that game need to be everywhere around Tamriel so that players of each alliance can make the same potions. Of course, there are workarounds to make that kind of stuff unique, but that's not the route that the developers took. Instead, we see that Tamriel white mushrooms, which do have some lore, are the alchemical ingredients, while most province-specific mushrooms, while having alchemical and magical properties in the lore, do not have an alchemical function in the alchemy system because of that gameplay limitation. My point here is that the fleshed out mushrooms are mostly those in the alchemy system that need to appear everywhere, while the mushrooms that are province specific often are the subjects of specific side quests or specific area stories. This means that there will be, by definition, far less of them, and not every bit of forest, for example, has its own side quest. So while, for example, Valenwood and Blackmarsh are covered in mushrooms, they are often the same mushrooms that appear in other provinces, just in higher volumes due to the province's ecological conditions. But they have to be the same as other provinces in order to function within the alchemy system. Do I like that they handled it like that? Not really, but I suppose that we're looking into something niche, and I'm pretty sure that I'm the first person to make a fuss about this more than 11 years after the game's launch, so I suppose it can be forgiven. So, we were at Blackmarsh. So, the first Blackmarsh unique mushroom is the so-called Blight Bog mushroom, which is native to the south of Blackmarsh. They thrive in wet swamp soil, and they're actually very solid as a food source, as they contain a ton of nutrients and can even be ground up to create fertilizer perfect for swamplands. This fertilizer is described to be miraculous and works amazingly well to cultivate plants in the swampland, making plants grow fast and strong, which is pretty cool. They tend to grow in places filled with death and decay in the swamp, so places where dead plants and decaying bodies occur. Now, the next mushroom is the so-called Lanciata foliota mushroom, a mushroom which specifically grows in Blackmarsh's damp caves that are populated by wamasuts or swamp dragons. The wet soil of these swamp caves, in combination with the presence of wamasuts, presumably because of their urine and poop in the soil, creates a suitable habitat for these mushrooms. Now, the mushrooms themselves are actually quite special. First of all, their spores are used in some tea flavors on Tamriel. And second of all, perhaps more interestingly, eating these mushrooms will put the consumer in a dreamlike state where they can communicate with spirits and track spirits. Now, while the Foliota is a family of fungi in real life, there isn't really any real life Foliota that compares to this one, so no real world comparisons and no talking to spirits. Alright, and that brings us to the final province, Morrowind. Now, Morrowind is known for its mushrooms, from gigantic ones dotting the land to smaller ones in caves and in the shadows of the bigger counterparts. Unfortunately, while many of them look super cool, most of them don't have much lore. But I'd like to bring back Hannah at least one more time to start off with Morrowind's biggest mushroom of all, the gigantic Emperor Parasol mushroom.
Towering across the landscapes of Solstheim, Emperor's parasol mushrooms are among the most iconic and culturally significant forms of fungal life in Skyrim. These enormous mushrooms have thick, woody beige or ashen gray stems and caps wide as rooftops. Their sienna-tinted caps and gill-lined undersides have become visual hallmarks of the Dunmer homeland. Unlike conventional mushrooms, Emperor's parasols are not harvested for food or alchemy in the usual sense. Their immense size and fibrous structure make them impractical to process directly. However, they are deeply integrated into Dunmer life, especially by House Telvanni, who use them as the literal foundation for their homes and strongholds. Rather than build with stone or timber, Telvanni wizards magically cultivate these towering fungi into livable structures. The most notable example of this practice is Tel Mithrin, a Telvanni settlement on southeastern Solstheim, established by Master Wizard Neloth in the early 4th era. Tel Mithrin consists of 4 mushroom towers grown from spores brought from Morrowind, shaped into Neloth's main tower, an apothecary, a kitchen, and a steward's residence. These buildings are accessed via spiraling fungal ramps, and the area is surrounded by useful flora like bleeding crown, fly amanita, and scathecrawl. The Telvanni's use of vertical architecture historically relied on levitation magic, a practice once essential to reach upper levels of their towers. Although the Levitation Act of 3rd Era 421 outlawed such magic across the Empire, Telvanni mages continued using it throughout Morrowind. By the 4th Era, levitation had become obscure, and newer towers like Tel Mithrin instead feature magical runes that elevate visitors without spells. This evolution in design reflects a blend of tradition and adaptation, allowing the Telvanni to maintain their arcane lifestyle despite changing magical norms. Yet perhaps the most important alchemical contribution of the Emperor's parasol lies not in its structure, but in what grows upon it. Draped beneath its massive cap is the Emperor parasol moss, a fibrous, deep green moss that trails like vines. Used in potions that fortify magicka, regenerate health, and enhance two-handed combat, this moss is one of the most potent natural reagents tied to Telvanni cultivation. In the Dragonborn DLC, players can interact with this ecosystem firsthand, helping Neloth maintain his tower by soaking taproots in enchanted waters or investigating magical anomalies near heartstone deposits. These quests subtly remind players that the mushroom towers are alive, constantly growing, and intimately tied to the land around them.
Thank you, Hannah. She will be back one last time before this video's end to tell you a bit about her channel, which is in the description, but for now let us continue with some lichens. Now, Morrowind has an abundance of lichens, most of which, and you know this mantra by now, don't have any lore other than that they are an alchemical ingredient and are named after their color. For example, we've got the golden lichen, the red lichen, the green lichen, the black lichen. They all grow on rocks, they all don't have any lore, well, except for the black lichen. As for the black lichen, we know that Quamas hate black lichen, so miners, so Quama miners, use it to keep the Quama out of their food stores in the Quama mines. That's it. I'm sorry, but despite Morrowind having some of the biggest variety of fungus that look the coolest, almost none of it has any, and I mean any, lore. For example, we've got the milk cap, this large white mushroom that we can find almost everywhere in Morrowind's ashlands. And we know of it that it looks cool in the Morrowind scenery, likely got its name from its white color, and that it starts out small when it's young, which is logical. That's all that we know, which is kind of disappointing, and you'll notice a trend like that with Morrowind's mushrooms, where we know one or two things and not much more. Because what we do know, however, about the milkcap and the other gigantic mushrooms of Vvardenfell is that they take a lot of nutrients from the volcanic soil of the province, and that because of these nutrients in the volcanic soil, they can grow so immensely big. That goes for almost all of them, just like they all grow basically in the entirety of Morrowind's volcanic regions. Like the red ink cap mushroom, which grows primarily in Morrowind's swampy areas. No other lore than that. The gigantic reddish-orange net shield mushroom is also one of the mushrooms that we have, which are presumably used by people to stand under as netches pass over the land, hence the name net shield. No other lore than that. The dark green morel, which is a large version of a green morel. No other lore than that. Oh, and the mantra continues with the sponge cap, which looks really cool as a mushroom, probably has its name because of the spongy texture of its umbrella cap. Guess what? No other lore than that. Oh, and have you heard of the Cantarella? Well, apparently nobody in Tamriel did, because despite them looking like really cool tall cup mushrooms, no lore, despite in real life small Cantarella mushrooms being awesome, very edible, but no other lore than that on Tamriel. Shame. The mantra continues with the buttercake mushroom, the large funnel cup mushroom, the blood-tooth toadstool. I mean, look how cool this mushroom is, but no lore. Also goes for the lava burst mushroom. I mean, look how cool this mushroom is. Even looks as if it's kind of erupting lava. No lore. Now, some mushrooms that we do know a little bit more about do exist. For example, next up we've got the mushroom that's called the stink cap. That one is actually very interesting, as it seems like they start out like this almost oval-ish shape, almost like a white egg with speckles. And then at one point in their lifespan, the oval egg shape on top kind of seems to explode, which probably makes a terrible smell, hence the name stink cap. And then they become these cool looking umbrella shaped mushrooms that presumably, according to the name, spread a terrible smell. Other than that, no lore, but hey, I'll take what I can get after the disaster that were the last few mushrooms. Really man, Morrowind is like the province with the coolest mushrooms of them all, yet with the littlest lore, as most of these outlandish mushrooms can't even be compared to anything in real life, so they should give them more lore than that we have to work with now. It sucks. For example, there are several other mushrooms that we know one or two things about, but that's really all, like the Gravencap mushroom. That one has a really sweet smell and grows on mainland Morrowind. That's it. We also have the Hyphaphacea mushroom, another shelf mushroom fungus growing on trees and cave walls. It has some draining alchemical properties, but that's all that we know. It's actually very similar to another shelf mushroom from Morrowind, the Bungler's Bane, which looks nearly identical but has different alchemical properties, mostly draining speed, endurance and strength. It also grows on trees, primarily tree trunks, though I haven't found one in any of the caves. So that's cool. Now, there are 3 mushrooms left. One is kinda cool, even though there's no lore again. It's the bloat spore mushroom. It's in the game files, just not in the game. Still, props to the UESP for finding this one, as it was a late last minute addition to this video script after I decided to check their flora article to see if I missed something, you know. Can't hit them all. And they also seemingly weren't able to find anything other than that it's intended for it to grow in the dark and damp locations of Morrowind, and according to the name it produces spores. Oh, and also bloat, an alchemical ingredient from Morrowind, was intended to be harvested from it. Now, finally we have 2 mushrooms that are both reused 3D model assets from other mushrooms, but at least we have some unique lore on them. And first of all, there's the Kwama cup mushroom, which when used in a mixture can become a pretty good fertilizer and tends to grow in Kwama mines, probably feeding off Kwama waste. And finally we have the so-called Caldera mushroom, which grows in the caldera north of Balmora. We know nothing about it. The guy who we do a quest for wants us to collect them because he feels like they have groundbreaking properties, but we hear nothing of the actual properties ever again. So it kind of feels like a scam. Yeah. I am honestly most disappointed in Morrowind. Like, I expected the coolest things that I would find them in Morrowind about mushrooms, but I just didn't. And I'm sorry about that, but hey, I have to work with the lore that we have. And it's not like I blame the developers here. Like, this is not a rant against Bethesda or like a rant against the Elder Scrolls universe. Like, they don't develop the lore. I mean, come on, it's mushrooms. Like, you don't really expect like this to have massive amounts of lore, and the fact that we're talking about it for an hour now is already kind of a miracle. That having been said, it was very interesting, and I hope that you learned something about the Elder Scrolls universe as well. And big thanks to my friend Hannah, who helped with the video. She does a lot of flora and fauna type stuff, and I'll let her introduce her own channel to you. It's in the description.
If you enjoyed exploring the alchemical side of mushrooms today, I invite you to visit my channel at Hannah the Hermit, where we delve deep into the lore, properties, and alchemical uses of ingredients across Tamriel. Recently, we took a close look at the towering mushroom trees of the Shivering Isles and their role in producing substances like black tar and unrefined green mote, depending on their regional origin. I also have a full breakdown on the harvestable glowing mushrooms, perfect if you're looking to bring a little bioluminescence into your alchemical repertoire. Many thanks to Imperial Knowledge for sharing this scholarly space. Now, back to him.
Thank you very much and thank you for your help. A link to her channel is in the description, and also specifically put the link to her video on the mushrooms of the Shivering Isles in the description. This was a video on the mushrooms of Tamriel, so not of the Oblivion Realms, but you know, you could watch that video and kind of treat it as an expansion. Definitely give her a watch. Alright, that being said, I sincerely hope that you learned something about the Elder Scrolls universe today. It was probably my longest video, even without Hannah's help. Like, this was probably the longest video that I've ever done on a single topic. So yeah, I really hope that you enjoyed it. I'm going to sleep now. But you know, subscribe, like, those kind of things. It's been a long time. I am tired. I am no longer making any sense. It's 2 AM over here when I'm recording this. Alright, thank you to the Patreon supporters that you see on screen. There's Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, King Chris 20, Steve G, Volker of Argonia, RB Dash, His Soul, Lexicon, Ranger, Komodo, Rakai, and Sorto Bushido. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen, so my YouTube members and my Patreon subscribers, that this channel stays afloat, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I will see all of you in the next lore video. Bye bye.